Hello and welcome everybody to this short video on hybrid regimes. My name is Judit Ricz. I'm an associate professor at the Department of World Economy at Corvinus University Budapest and also a member of this POPREBEL research team. In this video I will speak about hybrid regimes and their reinvented forms in the 21st century. For the background of this research, there are two important trends, as you might all know, that can be observed during the last decade, at the latest since the 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis. In the global political economy scene, democracy has been backsliding globally, and state involvement in the economy has been on the rise worldwide. In some large emerging economies, this rise of state interventionism dates even back earlier, as well as competitive authoritarianism has long historical precedents. What is more surprising, however, that even in the eve of the third decade of the new millennium, ongoing tendencies still show towards rising illiberalism, both in political and economic realms in many parts of the world. Along with the rise of populism and illiberalism, we can also observe the tendency towards heterodox economic policy answer, revealing unique specificities and characteristics in different countries, demonstrating, however, some common tendencies towards attacking institutional checks and balances, restraining the autonomy and independence of core market economy agencies and institutions, as well as attacking in general market coordination mechanisms and micromanaging some strategic economic sectors. Analysts tend to reflect these real-world changes by using the term hybrid regimes. Hybrid regimes, in a very general sense, oppose the simplistic dichotomies of either political or economic regime typologies and are used as a third category between dictatorships and democracy on the one hand, and liberal market economy or centrally planned socialist regimes on the other hand. Thus, in the political realm, hybrid regimes combine autocratic features with democratic ones. For example, they can simultaneously hold political repressions and regular elections, and are labeled, for example, by the classical works of Levitsky and Way on Latin America as competitive authoritarianism, or in the more recent works of János Kornai, a Hungarian economist, he calls these autocracies. Likewise, in the economic arena, hybrid regime can be contrasted to the two great ideal types of economic regime categories like capitalism and socialism. And this hybrid regime is most often called as state capitalism. There's a bestseller book of Joshua Kurlansik on state capitalism, how the return of statism transforms the world economy, which is from 2016. And of course, many authors already preceded this publication, just Jan Bremer in 2010 or Andreas Nölke in 2014. However, what is important for us in this video right now, that this interpretation of state capitalism as a third category in this economic system typology is in line with the Hungarian economist János Kornai's revisited system paradigm from his publication in 2016. However, it augments his argumentation into the sphere of the economy by claiming that the contemporary state capitalist regimes can be conceptualized as a real third type of existing economic systems, a hybrid category, which is, however, a steady and stable model variant and not a blurred middle way. So in the following, I would like to focus on the hybrid regimes from this economic perspective and try to interpret it as a stable model variant. There is, of course, very extended state capitalism research more recently, and there are many tensions, controversies along many scientists from the International Business School, from the more comparative capitalism research, and many other areas. However, two basic approaches can be delineated: the narrow interpretation of state capitalism, focusing primarily on state ownership and other indirect channels of state impacts on the corporate sectors, and tends to look primarily on the microeconomic level and on the efficiency impacts of this state ownership, state subsidies, such as to evaluate the performance of the so-called national champions. There is, however, also a much broader interpretation, the one on which we also rely in our own research project. And here, state capitalism is more understood as a special real type of economic systems where the state plays a leading role in the economy with the explicit aim to actively influence the long-term development trajectory of a country. With the words of Bartowski and his co-authors, state capitalism is an economic system where both the government's function and the scale of its intervention in the economy are incomparably larger than in developed market economies. And economic state functions significantly go beyond addressing just market failures. In state capitalism, admittedly, there still exists a significant private sector, core market economy institutions such as commodity market, capital market, convertible currency, but their role is to a significant extent set in an arbitrary, often ad hoc, discretionary manner by the government. And we try to stick to this systemic approach and this latter definition and aim to uncover some core characteristics and specificities of current state capitalist varieties by paying special attention to economic development outcomes and the sustainability of these hybrid regimes. As you all shall know, state intervention into the economy is not unprecedented in history. However, if we just look back at modern economic history, we see more or less three waves which can be differentiated as state capitalism or state interventionism. The first wave of statism dates back to the mid to late 19th century and was mainly characterized by trade protectionism. The United States, Germany, and some Scandinavian economies aimed at developing their domestic industries by protectionist measures such as using tariffs, establishing various state infrastructures, etc. The second wave of state intervention started basically after the Great Depression of 1929 and 33, when the United States, Europe, and the Soviet Union, on the other hand, started to intensify their economic development by extensive role of the state and aim to strongly force economic growth and development in their respective domestic economies. This was followed by the rapid rise of the East Asian developmental states after the Second World War, though with some important historical institutional antecedents, such as in the case of Japan already before the Second World War. State interventionism in this second stage was much more comprehensive and complex compared to the first wave, even though trade protectionism was replaced by incremental liberalization and export orientation. A much broader set of new instruments emerged to protect domestic industries and steer industrial development towards strategic sectors. State capitalism in this second stage has always included a certain degree of central economic planning, and state interventionism has for several decades characterized the industrialization efforts of these latecomer economies. Finally, the third wave of statism started around the late 90s and early 2000s, basically in large emerging economies such as China, Brazil, and India, and reveals significant differences from its earlier version. It's a much more multifaceted institutional construct based on a variety of formal and informal channels of state influence over the economic sectors, including changing forms of state ownerships, basically shifting from majority to minority ownership, and many other indirect channels of state influence, such as financial support provided by development banks or other state-owned and parastatal institutions, such as pension funds or sovereign wealth funds, and also extending to the use of regulatory measures. As a consequence, also new patterns between business and government sections emerges. For example, the rising significance of formal and informal interpersonal networks between state officials and the private firms, but also the extensive practice of meddling with prices in strategic sectors such as in energy, labor, and other important sectors. State interventionism even ranges in this recent third wave to monetary policy measures, international trade issues, or foreign direct investment agreements. Acknowledging the fact that contemporary state capitalist experiments differ from each other in many aspects and national varieties of contemporary state capitalism exist, we aim to look at a higher abstraction level on some core characteristics which might stand out as defining features of contemporary state capitalism. Based on formal research from Brazil, Egypt, South Africa, Argentina, and the classical historical models of East Asian developmental states, and in line with the existing extensive economic literature on state capitalism, we try to highlight some outstanding similarities and draw up the main operational logic of hybrid regimes from the economic perspective. The first assumption is that the core mechanisms operate along similar logic in many contemporary state capitalist regimes, as they share the ultimate aim to monopolize political power and to maximize the political power in time. More often than not, relying on strong, illiberal, charismatic leaders with personal aspiration to retain power also beyond the legally, constitutionally allowed time periods. Illiberal states are using very diverse forms of state interventionism in the economy for purely political aims to maintain political power as long as possible. And a good example for this is provided by the Russian case, where under very little political competition and very weak mechanisms of democratic control, the economic or business sector was captured by the state for its own purposes. And some good publications of Andrei Yakovlev provide an insight into this story. Business capture is, however, only one tool to maintain political power, and from country to country, very different, creative, and innovative tools can be observed to secure both the economic and political legitimacy of contemporary hybrid regimes. In the economic realm, many countries rely on external sources, such as oil revenues, EU funds, or unconditional loans from alternative sources, while others are also successful in securing internationally raising funds, such as mobilizing or even confiscating domestic savings, renationalizing strategic companies, or using monetary policy measures. In reality, mostly the combination of external and internal resources takes place. In the political realm, the non-level playing field for democratic elections can be often observed, while political power is also supported by the elimination of potentially critical voices, leading to constraints on free press, media, academia, civil organizations, etc. Economic populist measures have also been on the rise as a means to influence the electorate, ranging from price subventions of basic goods and services via huge and prestige luxury investments into megasport infrastructure or organizing megasport events, to supporting national champions as symbols or emblematic examples of successful national development. Sometimes geopolitical and geostrategical aspects, such as aspiration to become global or at least regional leaders, have been also at play. Nationalist tendencies often go hand in hand with anti-globalist rhetoric, rather with a selective implementation, as the economic viability of these hybrid regimes usually depends heavily on foreign direct investment and multinational companies, both for tax revenues and for employment purposes. Thus, their positive discrimination is often institutionalized with strategic partnership agreements, while the negative attitude towards some hostile actors in domestically strategic sectors might be negatively discriminated by specific tax levies and other selective or discretionary measures. In extreme cases, even nationalization or hostile regulatory and financial measures can be observed. The main characteristics of contemporary hybrid regimes can be summed up as the following 5 important points. The return of the state as a designer of economic development, active role in shaping economic structures via multiple channels ranging from ownership rights to regulatory mechanisms and selective policy measures, overarching centralization tendencies prevailing in decision-making not only in the political but in the economic realm, strong and rising entanglements between politics and business, intensifying and leading to state or business capture, depending on initial power balances, widespread corruption, rent-seeking, patronage, and cronies dominating as an embedded social phenomenon, as a special tool of economic coordination mechanism, and finally, the legitimacy of strong states, illiberal, charismatic leaders, which has a roots in some kind of socially expected paternalism. This also highlights already the importance of interactive linkages between the economic and political realm and the need for this systemic approach to essentially understand the operational logic of hybrid regimes. As the ultimate aim of state capitalist regimes is to maintain political power, questions of economic efficiency, development, or equality, and the goal of any kind of long-term sustainable economic development are secondary relevance at best, but mostly not even coming to to fore. This is a very important difference to the historically successful catching up stories of the East Asian developmental states. Recent tendencies of new economic nationalisms are better captured under the term economic patriotism because they do not really serve the nation as a whole, but rather a tiny part of the nation, those who we can call the political patriots, cronies, loyal or co-opted economic elites. Contemporary state capitalist regimes tend to be illiberal both in the economic and political realm, and as a conscious political strategy, they tend to downplay democratic institutions and liberal economic values. In most contemporary hybrid regimes, we can observe tendencies to attack checks and balances, hurt the independence of institutions and agencies, attacks on the media, free press, the academia, the NGO sector and civil organizations, and also attacks on environmental sustainability, or at least downplaying the constraints of the environment are taking place. As a rather cross-cutting issue, the already mentioned spread of overarching corruption and rent-seeking mechanisms as a systemic characteristic can be also observed. All in all, these illiberal measures aimed at consolidating political power tend to disregard economic or development considerations, and even worse, though often remaining hidden in the short term. On the longer run, these might add up and hurt the sustainability and inclusivity of development. As classic examples, short business-oriented attacks on environmental sustainability, populist measures against social cohesion, academic freedom and free press can be highlighted. It is also straightforward to see that megalomaniac, nationalist and often luxury prestige infrastructural projects drain resources from public budget and lead to underinvestment into productive infrastructure, into human capital, health and education system. Overarching centralization and autocratic tendencies tend to limit the chances of bottom-up feedback and undermine the responsiveness of popular sentiment. All these forces are, on the longer run, unconducive to broadly defined sustainable and inclusive development, which should be based on structural changes toward a knowledge and innovation-led, socially inclusive, and environmental-friendly development trajectory. Regarding the sustainability of these hybrid regimes, the striking example can be Venezuela, where the post-Chavista regime is struggling to survive, but this struggle goes on already for almost a decade. And this Venezuelan story also highlights the well-known trade-off in hybrid regimes. When economic legitimacy is waning, increased political repression is often the answer to lengthen the survival of the regime, at a huge social and economic cost, of course. But in the political realm, this might even turn this regime into a full-blown authoritarian regime. To put the sustainability of hybrid regimes into a wider perspective, we might recall the classic work of Levitsky and Weil on hybrid regimes, who look at the political dimension, and they show that the number of competitive authoritarian regimes has remained relatively steady over the last quarter century, by which they mean that in 2019, with a rather conservative estimation, they characterized 32 countries all over the world as competitive authoritarian regimes. As long as in their original works from 1990 to 1995, they have put 35 countries into the same category. And the same empirical study has found that out of these originally examined 35 cases, 19 competitive authoritarian regimes have survived 15 years, and this supports to some extent the longevity of these hybrid regimes. Looking at the economic perspective and the already mentioned Kurlansik book, he applies a rather strict definition of state capitalism. Those countries whose government has an ownership stake or significant influence over more than 1/3 of the 500 largest companies by revenues in a country. And he looks only at the 60 biggest economies in the world, and even by this very strict approach and definition, he classifies 22 countries in 2016 as state capitalists, and some important cases are left out, such as from the Central Eastern European region, and also from some other regions of the world, which would classify as state capitalists by looking at all economies in the world irrespective of their size, or by using a wider definition or interpretation of state capitalism currently. What we shall emphasize, however, that changes in the political and economic realm interact, and this is a very vibrant research area which studies exactly these interactions, how illiberal changes, democratic backsliding, populist tendencies in politics might impact upon the operation and operational logic of the economic system, and of course also vice versa. So this calls for more interaction between political scientists, political economy scholars, sociologists, economists, and in wider sense, the representatives of social sciences. Finally, to put the most recent wave of rising state interventionism and the emergence of hybrid regimes in the 21st century into a historical perspective, we can claim that hybrid regimes in general and state capitalism especially seems to be a steady and stable model variant and not having merely some transitionary feature, but seems to be a new type between the ideal types of the great political or economic system governance forms with its own value and surviving specificities. These presumptions entails that hybrid regimes will most probably stay with us in the future, though often in reinvented forms with new, creative and innovative changes both in the political and economic spheres and their interactions might provide certain stability for the model variant over time and sustaining it at least for certain time periods in certain places. Whereas the sustainability of these regimes is not necessarily linked to their economic outcomes or economic efficiency, as looking both at historical and contemporary cases, one can find examples of good and bad economic performance in competitive authoritarian regimes as well. However, economic competitiveness in the 21st century requires some degree of policy responsiveness, as it's well illustrated by the already mentioned bestseller book of Joshua Colanzi. Thank you very much for your attention.